Hello, my name is Heather Smith, and in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Thomas, we would like to welcome you back to our series on integrated multi-tiered systems of support. This is the second module in the series focused on targeted data-based decision-making. We will cover how to use diagnostic assessments to select intervention and monitor progress using progress monitoring tools. This is the agenda for this module. First, we will take some time to review how the three DBDM processes are connected and revisit the universal DBDM process. Then, we will cover the elements of targeted DBDM, which include diagnostic assessments, selecting interventions, progress monitoring, and data decision rules. Finally, we will outline what targeted DBDM might look like in practice and leave you with next steps to begin implementing your own effective targeted DBDM process. As you can see, this module will cover a significant level of content. Please feel free to take breaks, pause the video for discussion, or break up this training in a way that makes the most sense for where your building is on its journey to effective IMTSS implementation. First, let's revisit how all of the DBDM processes relate to one another. Data-based decision-making can be thought of as a roadmap to supporting students. The DBDM process and the data used within those processes are the guide for how to provide students support as they take their educational journey. We will use a roundabout to help us visualize the fluidity of these processes. Each year, students enter the roundabout of a new school year. In an effective multi-tiered system, students are provided Tier 1 on-level instruction and given benchmark assessments to determine their level of understanding in specific areas, often in the areas of reading, math, and social-emotional behavioral wellness. An effective universal DBDM process that correctly identifies students in need of intervention lays the foundation for effective targeted and intensive DBDM processes, as well as increases the effectiveness of identifying students with true disabilities. Regardless of their performance on these screening assessments, all students continue to receive Tier 1 instruction. They continue to stay in the universal roundabout, if you will. Any students whose data indicate that they are slightly below grade level will then be taken through the targeted DBDM process to match them to an intervention and monitor their progress. Students are moving in and out of this process as indicated by the data and corresponding data decision rules. Again, they continue to receive Tier 1 instruction as they are in the targeted DBDM system. Similar to the targeted DBDM system, students whose data indicates that they are significantly below level go through the intensive DBDM process to be matched to an intervention and monitor their progress. Again, students move in and out of this process as determined by the data and data decision rules and will continue to receive Tier 1 instruction at the same time they are getting these Tier 3 supports. Finally, there are some students whose data will indicate a more severe or urgent need in one or multiple areas, and they will enter the special education referral process. Again, notice that the targeted, intensive, and special education arrows each point both in and out of the roundabout of universal DBDM. This reminds us two things. First, it reminds us that the targeted and intensive processes are temporary and students may move in and out of these levels of support. Students should not stay in either of these systems indefinitely. These arrows also remind us that there should be ongoing communication between these DBDM processes and the universal Tier 1 system. Note that even the special education arrow points in both directions because students should not be receiving these supports in isolation from their Tier 1 instruction. Even when a student is receiving special education services, those teachers and systems should be reciprocally communicating about the student's needs and progress. One final note before we move on to look more closely at targeted DBDM. You will have some students who are achieving well beyond the grade level expectations. We'll refer to these students as the enrichment group. While this population is not represented on the traditional MTSS pyramid, and we will not spend much time talking about them in these modules, it is important to consider supports for these students as well. For some students, not being challenged enough can be just as frustrating and demotivating as feeling like they're failing. Again, we will not speak to this population much in this series, but please keep them in mind as you review student data and consider ways in which individual student needs are supported. Now we will review the components and purpose of the Universal DBDM process and give your team an opportunity to reflect on the work you have been doing with your Universal DBDM. Let's see what your team remembers about Universal DBDM. You will be prompted to pause the recording and discuss with your team after each of the following 4 questions are posed. Let's give it a try. What is the goal of the Universal DBDM process? Pause and discuss. If you said the goal of the Universal DBDM process is to evaluate baseline data on all students and determine which students would benefit from specific support or intervention, you're right. The key takeaway here are all students and identifying students needing intervention. Next, what is reviewed during the Universal DBDM process? Pause and discuss. During the DBDM process, teams should review screening data. It is ideal to have multiple data sources for each subject area, so decisions about student interventions are not based on one assessment. However, if you're benchmarking in multiple subject areas, you risk over-assessing students. This is one of the reasons it is important to choose evidence-based assessments. They have been identified as assessments that correctly indicate students' area of need for intervention. This is also why it is important that teachers and administrators be knowledgeable about assessments, the assessment protocols, and how to interpret the assessment results. How often should the Universal DBDM process occur? Pause and discuss. Benchmark assessments should be administered and the data reviewed 3 times a year. In the fall, to get baseline scores and determine needed interventions. In the winter, to get an update on student progress and to determine if there are additional students in need of intervention. And in the spring, to determine where students ended the year and provide data helpful in monitoring the effectiveness of your school's IMTSS framework. Finally, who should be involved in the Universal DBDM process? Pause and discuss one more time. The Universal DBDM process should involve teams of educators that reflect all relevant areas of expertise. Often, these conversations happen during grade-level data team meetings and involve classroom teachers, special education teachers, an administrator, and, when available, support staff such as an instructional coach or a school psychologist. We want to bring to mind again this graphic that may be familiar to you now. The highlighted box reminds us that the Universal DBDM process involves Tier 1 instructional practices and screening data for all students. As a reminder, from Module 1, Quality Universal or Tier 1 DBDM includes educators with all relevant areas of expertise, uses validated screening data, uses consistent data decision rules, considers students' language, cultural background, and communication with stakeholders. Before we move on to discussing targeted DBDM, you will have an opportunity to reflect on the Universal DBDM steps you took with your team. Pause the video and reflect with your team on whether or not these steps of the Universal DBDM process have been completed. If there is a step your team has not completed, take a moment now to put a plan in place for completing that step. Through the Universal DBDM process, you should have answered the question, which students are at risk and require intervention? In this module, we will discuss how the targeted DBDM process uses diagnostic data to answer these 2 questions. What specific skill requires remediation? what intervention can meet that need? And progress monitoring data can be used to answer the question, is the intervention effective? First, we'll take a look at 4 critical components of targeted DBDM. After we've defined each piece separately, we will explain how these 4 pieces work together to create an effective targeted DBDM process. This is an overview of the targeted DBDM process. You will collect diagnostic assessment data, analyze diagnostic data and decide on an intervention, document that plan, communicate that plan with all relevant stakeholders, work the plan, meaning you'll actually do the intervention, progress monitor student progress, review the progress monitoring data and adapt the intervention as indicated by the data decision rules. You will continue that cycle of analyzing and modifying the intervention until the student no longer needs the intervention or requires a Tier 3 support. These are 4 key elements of the targeted DBDM process we will go over in depth in this module. Then we will close our time in this session with an overview of what this process might look like in action. First, let's build a common understanding of what a diagnostic assessment is and how it is used. The California Department of Education states that diagnostic assessments are intended to help teachers identify what students know and can do in different domains to support student learning. These kinds of assessments may help teachers determine what students understand in order to build on the students' strengths and address their specific needs. So, in short, a diagnostic assessment identifies specific targeted skills for students in the assessed content area. Let's clarify the difference between a topic-specific assessment and a diagnostic assessment. Often as teachers, we administer a pretest before beginning a new topic. Many times, these pretests are set up in a way that allows us to see what areas of this new topic students are already familiar with and what seems to be new material. This type of assessment helps guide our instruction, spending more time on things the class may not understand yet and less time on things they do. Topic-specific post-tests can also tell us if a student didn't quite master a piece of that topic and may benefit from additional reteaching. These types of assessment are great Tier 1 instructional tools. However, when we are talking about diagnostic assessments in terms of IMTSS and intervention placement, we are not referring to topic-specific assessments. In the context of IMTSS and intervention placement, when we refer to diagnostic assessments, we mean assessments that cover material across the content area's domains. For example, a math diagnostic assessment would cover number sense, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, etc., not just one topic. Diagnostic assessments are intended to pinpoint specific strengths or skill deficits. A topic-specific assessment usually tells you if a student does or does not understand a specific topic. It does not show you what topics or skills outside of the assessed topic are understood. A diagnostic assessment would give you this information. Diagnostic assessments are intended to guide placement in an intervention that is outside the window of a specific topic. For example, I may be teaching a unit on long division for 6 weeks, but if I have a student whose diagnostic assessment indicates that she has learning gaps in multiplication, she will receive the Tier 1 instruction in long division for those 6 weeks, but she will also be receiving a multiplication intervention for as long as the data indicates that support is needed through targeted DBDM process. Interventions based on diagnostic assessments are not tied to the topic currently being studied in the Tier 1 classroom. So, the big takeaways when differentiating between these 2 types of assessments is that topic-specific assessments guide Tier 1 instruction, and diagnostic assessments guide intervention placement and an intervention focus. This is where a diagnostic assessment fits in with the IMTSS framework. You give all your students your universal screening assessment and analyze the data as discussed in Module 1. Students who score on grade level according to the chosen measure receive Tier 1 instruction and are screened 3 times a year using the universal screening process. Students who score below the on-level criteria on the universal screening assessment should be given a diagnostic assessment to determine the specific target skill that needs to be addressed. You may be using a universal screener that has a diagnostic function, such as the STAR. This can be very helpful when used correctly. However, we do encourage you to also explore other diagnostic tools available to help verify specific areas of need. After a diagnostic assessment has been used to identify the target skill, that information is used to match the student with an appropriate, evidence-based intervention. The students will begin the intervention, then progress will be monitored using the DBDM process. We will go further into choosing an intervention and monitoring progress shortly. First, let's take a few examples of diagnostic assessments. This is a screenshot of an assessment called the Phonics Screener for Intervention, or PSI, written by the 95% group. This is a reading diagnostic assessment that requires students to identify various elements of language in a developmental manner. This assessment is given to students who are struggling with reading accuracy and pinpoint specific decoding needs. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to administer and provides specific information on which to base choosing a reading intervention. This assessment also includes a guide to help you group students with similar needs into intervention groups. STAR, Reading, and Math also have a diagnostic component. After students take the universal screener, you can pull up individual diagnostic reports. These reports give you a breakdown of how well the student did on each individual skill. STAR also has a function that allows you to create intervention groups based on like needs. One note about STAR and any computer-based assessment. Make sure you incorporate looking at how long the student took to complete the assessment as part of your review of data. If a student scores significantly lower than expected, it is important to rule out that they didn't just quickly click through each question. You don't want to misassign students to an intervention group or use limited resources on students who do not actually need the intervention. This is a screenshot of an FBA, or Functional Behavioral Assessment. This can be a valuable assessment when determining what intervention would benefit a displayed behavior. Remember, 2 students with the same exhibited behavior could have different reasons for showing that behavior. So it is important to use assessments such as this to figure out why the student is acting in that way. If you are going to put in the effort and resources to address a behavior, you want to make sure you're addressing the right student need. These are just 3 examples of a variety of diagnostic assessments available. The key, however, is to make sure it is an assessment that will pinpoint a student's understanding of key concepts and skills across the content area being assessed. Again, these assessments are not topic specific. What diagnostic assessments do we use and what do we need? Are there any assessments we thought were diagnostic assessments but are really topic specific rather than encompassing all subject area content? After you've used a diagnostic assessment to determine the specific area of need for a student within a content area, you will then choose an evidence-based intervention to support that specific area of need. Let's take a look at what we are defining as an intervention. First, it's important that we distinguish an intervention from differentiation or a Tier 1 accommodation. An accommodation is something put in place that allows students to access Tier 1 curriculum and instruction, such as preferred seating, guided notes, or a modified task. These things all happen within Tier 1 instruction and simply allow equitable access to grade level material. Differentiation is something many teachers have so seamlessly built into the way they teach, they may not even realize it's something they're doing. Differentiation strategies are strategies that allow multiple access points to Tier 1 curriculum. Examples might include things such as guided reading or guided math groups, presenting content in a both visual and auditory fashion, or providing options in how students show understanding of a concept. Again, these are all strategies that happen within Tier 1 instruction and content. So, when we refer to interventions, we are no longer talking about Tier 1 instruction. An intervention is instruction that is in addition to Tier 1 instruction and happens outside of Tier 1 instruction time. Students receiving an intervention should participate in Tier 1 instruction along with all other students, then have another time in the day when they are provided their Tier 2 or Tier 3 instruction. An example of this might be a 7th grade student whose universal screener indicates an area of need in the fraction domain. The student goes to his normal math block to receive the grade level math instruction like his peers. But then, during the intervention period, he receives a fraction-focused intervention each day. Here's a chance to see if you and your team can distinguish between an accommodation, differentiation, and an intervention. After I read the question, pause the video and discuss with your team which category the scenario best fits. When you arrive at an answer, turn the video back on and see if you're correct. The first one, a teacher provides a student who suffers from some hearing loss a designated seat near the front of the classroom. Now pause the video and see if you know which one it is. If you said accommodation, you're right. This is an example of an accommodation because designating a student preferential seating allows access to the Tier 1 curriculum during Tier 1 instructional time. Let's try another one. After learning about the Revolutionary War, students are given a choice of creating a short video, an art piece, or writing a historical fiction piece to demonstrate their understanding of key concepts. Pause and discuss. This is an example of differentiation. We know this is differentiation because all students are being asked to show their understanding of the Tier 1 curriculum, but they have options in how they present that information based on their individual strengths. We'll do 2 more. A student who struggles with attention is given the option of taking a quick break after completing every 3 problems on his math assignment. Pause and discuss. If you said accommodation, you are right. We know this is an accommodation because the student is still accessing Tier 1 curriculum during Tier 1 instructional time. But because he struggles with attention, he is given breaks so he can more equitably engage in grade level content with his peers. Last one. A student's universal screener indicated she was slightly below grade level in her ability to comprehend text. So she is placed in a Tier 2 comprehension group that meets during the grade level's RTI block. Pause and discuss one last time. This is an example of an intervention because she's still receiving Tier 1 instruction, but in addition to that instruction, she also is provided specific comprehension instruction during a specific intervention block. Remember, these interventions are chosen based on the results from your diagnostic assessment. There are often multiple reasons why a student could be struggling with a specific skill. So, you want to make sure that you're correctly matching the skill deficit with the intervention. You wouldn't want to put a student who struggles with fluency in a decoding group if the real issue is phonemic awareness. Or if a student struggles with outbursts during class, you wouldn't want to assign them to a check-in, check-out intervention if the motivation is to avoid adult attention. So utilize universal screening data and diagnostic data supported by classroom data to help indicate which intervention is most appropriate for your students. And again, it is important the intervention you choose is evidence-based. You want to know you are putting adult time, resources, and the student's learning time to good use by doing something that has been shown to be effective. Here are 3 of the online resources we find helpful when looking for evidence-based interventions. Many of these resources are free, so we encourage you to explore each of them. Next, we'll discuss progress monitoring tools and how they are used in the targeted DBDM process. These are all examples of progress monitoring charts. You'll see charts tracking step activity, tracking monthly electricity prices, and weights of boys on average for each age group. What do all of these have in common? They track a quantity over time, and they're used to monitor and make decisions. These are 3 of the characteristics of progress monitoring measures. They need to be quick and easy to administer. They should occur in multiple parallel forms, meaning they should be the same difficulty, the same format, and the same content each time they're given. They should be standardized in administration and how they're scored, meaning they should be the same timing, setting, and scoring rules each and every time. Pause and discuss with your team why these qualities are important when giving a progress monitoring measure. Another key feature of a progress monitoring measure is that the data can be graphed. This allows you to not only see if they are increasing their scores, but if they are on track to meet their goal, if the goal is reasonable, if the intervention is working as well as expected, and allows you to apply decision rules. An added benefit is that it is a clear picture that can be shared with the student and family to engage them in the process. To most accurately monitor the impact of an intervention with a progress monitoring assessment, there are a few steps to get started so that you end up with a comprehensive and clear graph like this one. The first step is to determine where the student is starting from. Before we can set a goal for where we want the student to be at the end of the intervention cycle, we need to establish a baseline. To do that, I gave the student 3 measures of the CBM in about a week and a half. If I just gave one, it might have fallen on a bad day or an especially good day, and that would not be the most accurate picture of the student. So I gave 3 different progress monitoring assessments and took the median or middle score as the baseline. This will be our starting point from which to grow. Now that I know the starting line, I can place the finish line more appropriately. Of course, I want my student to be at grade level, but that is not always realistic. I want to set an ambitious but reasonable goal. In a purchased progress monitoring tool on my computer, it often sets that for you by looking at a normed data set and the average rate of improvement for similar students. If you don't have a tool that does it for you, you can think about how many weeks of intervention times and how many points they can reasonably improve in a week. So, for example, if I'm looking at reading words per minute and the student can reasonably read 1 more word per minute each week, I would multiply 1 by the number of weeks left, 13, to add 13 words per minute to her current score to set a reasonable but ambitious goal. If you have someone in your district or school building that can set these graphs up for your teachers, that is an excellent use of their time and makes life easier for the other staff. After we've gathered the baseline data and set up our graph, which includes our performance goals, it's time to implement the intervention. Note that we set the baseline prior to making changes to the instruction so we can measure the impact of the intervention. We will then continue to administer the progress monitoring measure at regular intervals. Typically, we progress monitor a Tier 2 student academically every other week. For behavior progress monitoring tools, this time frame may vary. The important thing is to do this consistently, and remember that research shows that 4 to 6 data points are needed before you have an accurate enough picture to make a decision about the effectiveness of an intervention. Testing weekly means you'll have that information in 4 to 6 weeks. Bi-weekly will take 8 to 12 weeks to have that many data points. Once you have 4 to 6 data points, you are ready to review the graph and make an informed decision using your decision rules. We will go over that process in the coming slides. This is an example of what a progress measurement graph might look like using a CBM. Remember, CBM stands for a curriculum-based measure. Students' current level of performance is established by collecting and graphing baseline data. From the baseline data, a long-range goal is set for the student across the time that the teacher will monitor. The goal line is in green. For each intervention phase, the student's slope of performance can be compared to the long-range goal line. Slopes are in white. You can see in intervention 1, instruction was not effective, so an instructional change was implemented. This change had a positive effect on students' performance, as can be seen by looking at the trend line in intervention 2. Pause here and as a team, review this graph and answer these questions. Is the student making adequate progress toward his or her goal? How do you know, and how could you confirm? Is the intervention effectively meeting the student's needs? How do you know, and how could you confirm? Next, we'll talk more about data decision rules and how they are used in the targeted DBDM process. There is some graphing vocabulary you may or may not be familiar with that will help your team in applying decision rules consistently. First is trend. The trend is a projection of progress over time based on the data points entered. In this example, the green triangles represent the student word sequences on a writing CBM. Based on the trend line, it can be projected out to show that if you continue this intervention exactly as is, the student will likely continue to improve and will likely be at 8 or 9 by the end of the intervention period. The other key component to attend to is the goal line. Seen in the example, it is purple. A goal of 16 words was set based on the baseline of 4 words using a normed rate of improvement that came with the measure. So to determine the effectiveness of the intervention plan, we will compare the trend to the goal to see if the student is likely to make their established goal. In this example, though the student is improving, the rate of improvement is not sufficient to meet the goal. When reviewing graph data, decisions are made by comparing the trend line to the goal line. The relationship between the two will inform your next steps. You'll look and see if the trend line is steeper than the goal line. If it is, then the student will surpass the goal. If the trend line is the same or even with the goal line, the student is on track to meet their goal. If the trend line is below or flatter than the goal line, the student is not on track to meet their goal and a change is likely needed. Based on these comparisons, there are 3 possible decisions. If the student is likely to surpass the goal, you can increase the goal or begin to fade the intensity of the intervention. If the student is on track, you'll continue as is. If the student is not on track to meet the goal, we'll first check the fidelity. Was the student present for the intervention? Was the intervention given as intended? If not, our first step is to improve fidelity so we can get an accurate picture of its effectiveness. If fidelity is ensured, then we will change the intervention. That may be a small tweak, the addition of a behavior support, or a large change like a focus on a more basic skill with a different intervention. That decision will be aided by the experts you've invited to collaborate on your team. Now we're going to apply what we've just learned. In this example, the dotted trend line matches the green goal line. What decision would you make? Pause and discuss. The decision would be to keep things as is. You will reevaluate the student's graph after the 4 to 6 additional data points to determine whether to raise the goal, change instruction, or keep as is. Though you should see the graph each week as you update it, so if you notice a drastic negative turn, you can consider intervening earlier. In this example, the trend line is steeper than the purple goal line. What decision would you make? Pause and discuss. The decision would likely be to increase the goal or fade the intervention. If the student's current goal is already the end of the year benchmark for his or her grade, then continue with the current goal but consider lessening the intensity of the intervention. The new goal can simply be an extension of the current trend line. You will insert a vertical line to indicate the point where you raised your student's goal. You should reevaluate the student's graph after collecting 4 to 6 more data points to determine whether the student's new goal is appropriate. On this graph, the trend line is flatter than the goal line. What decision would you make? Pause and discuss. The decision should be to check fidelity, and if insured, you will change instruction. Note that the decision should not be to lower the goal or the goal line. The instructional program should be tailored to bring a student's scores up so they match or surpass the goal line. Draw a vertical line to indicate the point where you made an instructional change. Reevaluate the student's graph after 4 to 6 data points to determine whether the change was effective. Once you have data collected and graphed, you'll meet with your targeted DBDM team to make collaborative decisions. In the universal DBDM process, you'll recall our purpose was to identify students in need of an intervention. Now, in targeted DBDM, our purpose is to ensure the needs of those students are identified as slightly below grade level receive appropriate and effective support. To accomplish this, teams will match students to appropriate interventions based on diagnostic data and then review progress monitoring data to determine if the student is making progress toward their goal or if a change is needed to better meet their needs. This decision-making will happen when making initial intervention assignments and then every 4 to 6 weeks during the intervention to review the data. When reviewing diagnostic data to establish interventions, a good rule of thumb is to work on the most fundamental content or skill needed first, though your team or district may establish specific decision rules for you. When it comes to reviewing progress monitoring data, we apply the decision rules of comparing the trend line to the goal line, which we just covered. This is a sample timeline for students moving through the targeted DBDM process. First, in early September, the teacher would administer the universal screening. Then, in mid to late September, the teacher would administer the diagnostic assessment to the students who scored below grade level on the screener. Next, in mid to late September, the targeted DBDM team would analyze the diagnostic data, use that data to select an intervention, then document the intervention plan and communicate that plan to stakeholders. Next, in early October, the interventionist would begin the intervention. 2 weeks after starting the interventionist would begin administering the progress monitoring assessment and graphing those results. After that, every 4 to 6 weeks, those graphed data will be reviewed by the targeted DBDM team, and data decision rules would be used to determine next steps. We have primarily focused on students who have arrived on the targeted DBDM list because they scored below the on-level cut score on the chosen universal screener. When this is the case, the necessary related documentation might include their name listed on a master targeted DBDM spreadsheet with meeting dates listed in each column and their names linked to a folder containing their related data, such as their intervention plan and progress monitoring graphs. Some students, however, will come to the targeted DBDM team through teacher referral. This could happen because a student initially scored in the on-level range on the universal screener, but then started showing performance below level in class. It is probably more often the case, however, that a teacher brings a student to the targeted DBDM team due to a behavior or social emotional concern. For these students, you will want the same documentation as the students from Path 1, but in addition, you might consider having a teacher complete a Tier 2 referral form. This is an example of a student referral form. The steps in red lead the team through the conversation. Some similar forms even include the estimated number of minutes that should be spent discussing each step so the team doesn't get stuck on one piece of the process. The process that makes sense for your district or building will depend on systems and technology already available. Remember, the goal is to build and make more efficient what you already have in place, rather than recreate whenever possible. Whatever system you choose for organizing student data, it should include some system for keeping track of students receiving Tier 2 interventions, when the team has discussed the student, a place to store relevant data, and most importantly, make sure that whatever process you decide to use is clearly defined and clearly communicated to staff. Here is a summary overview of the targeted DBDM process. You will start with collecting the diagnostic data to pinpoint the specific need. Then you will work with your targeted DBDM team, likely your grade level data team, to analyze that data and match the priority need to an evidence-based intervention. Next, the team will document the plan, making sure to include specifics such as when the intervention will take place, for how long, and who will administer the intervention. You will communicate this plan to relevant stakeholders such as parents and involved teachers. Then work the plan. Put the intervention in place. Make sure to conduct progress monitoring every 2 weeks or in accordance with the progress monitoring tools guidelines. Then continue the cycle of reviewing the progress monitoring data with the team every 4 weeks, adjusting the intervention when needed until the student no longer needs the intervention or data indicates that a Tier 3 intervention is needed. As we wrap up, we'll consider what next steps your building needs to take in the area of targeted DBDM. The following slides will provide you and your team time to assess where you are with your implementation of targeted DBDM. Review the question, pause to discuss, reflect and plan, then move on to the next question. First, what teams do you already have in place that could serve as the targeted DBDM team? Or what teams would make sense to serve as the targeted DBDM team? What systems need to be put in place in order for this team to function effectively? Consider things such as a regular meeting place and time, data storage and scheduling processes, forms to collect and track student plans and data. Do you need additional diagnostic tools? If so, in what areas? Who can be in charge of reaching out for diagnostic assessment resources? What additional interventions and progress monitoring tools do you need? Who can be in charge of exploring some of the provided websites to find free resources that might be helpful? Is there someone that would be willing to create graphs for progress monitoring data that teachers could use easily? We hope you now have a relatively firm understanding of the targeted DBDM process. Our next module will be over the intensive DBDM decision-making process. Don't worry, this process is very similar to the targeted DBDM process. You will learn about the intensive DBDM process in the third module called Intensive DBDM Decision Making. Thank you again for your time, and as always, don't hesitate to reach out with questions or for support. Until we see you next time, thank you.